Students and teachers are dismissed for Children's Church. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to be talking about Moses this morning. But before we get there, have you ever had a nickname that you hated? Someone that probably may not have liked you so much may have given you, and it stuck with you for a long time. My best friend, I don't really know where he got his nickname, but his whole family just calls him Chunk. I can come up with a few ideas of where that came from. But anyway, I think we all have different nicknames that we've been known by, but sometimes we know ourselves by nicknames that maybe nobody else does. When I was growing up, I would have probably called myself the get-by kid because everything I did was just to get by. I never was fully in on anything. I never really tried my hardest. School was about the lowest priority I had in life, to the point, and this is not to brag or to even show how bad I am, when I graduated with about 182 students in high school, and they classify you by your GPA in order and by number. I was like 176, okay? I graduated with a 1.2 something GPA, so get by kid. That was what I would call myself. I just got by. And so it comes with that when I was also in high school, there was a particular teacher who was very not fond of who I was or my family. And one time, she was upset and she said, "Ben, you are never going to make anything of yourself. You are just a failure." Now, I am not excusing what that teacher said, but I also never gave her a reason to think anything different. I was a failure at life, at school, at relationships, whatever it was. I could ruin a friendship like that if I wanted to. I was very good at it because I didn't want people to get too close to me. But you start to hear things like that, and you become very self-conscious, and you start thinking of yourself in those ways. And so if you ever thought of yourself as inadequate, unqualified, unprepared, weak, old, out of shape, sinful, ruined, waste, trash, or worthless. Those are just some of the things I've thought of myself and my sinful side that is thought negatively about God's creation. Now think of this, when we think of people who have made major advances in technology, in culture, science, those who've built nothing into something. When we look at people who, as a pastor, I look at preachers and I listen to a lot of Christian leaders in our culture right now who've built churches from, in a garage to this multi-campus, multi-thousand different people. And I look at them and I don't think inadequate, useless, waste, trash. I think of the good. But what makes them different than us? So when we look at those people, we may begin to despise them because they have reached a certain point that we're not at, or we don't think that they're too far beyond where we could ever get to, and we think of them in a negative view, but they are God's creation as well. But I think it's very easy, and maybe it's me, to just think too negatively about myself or ourselves, and we think that we're not good enough, we're not classy enough, we don't have this or we don't have that. It's easy to say, who am I that God would let me do this or that? I'm not worthy. We tend to think that I could never do that. But as we've seen in Scripture, when God calls us to something, He has prepared us for it. And He can do amazing things in all of our circumstances. I think, for me, I like underdog stories. I like superhero movies. I really don't like, when I go to see a movie and I want the good guys to win, I am like cranky when the bad guy or when the good guy loses. I don't like that. It bothers me. I want the good guy to win. I'm stereotypical and I'm okay with that. But I want the good guy to win. I like that underdog story. One of my favorite movies as a kid was Rudy. I mean, just a really powerful movie, right? And there's so many different examples. In the Bible, there's a man who carries a jar of water. We don't know his name. We don't really know where he lived. We just know that there was this man. The disciples said in Mark 14, Jesus tells his disciples, go find this man who's carrying a jar of water and go to his home and prepare the Passover meal. I mean, this guy's a nobody. He's got a house and he knows where to get water. I mean, that's like his greatest attribute in the story is he knows where to get water and he has a house. And Jesus says, go there, prepare the meal. That guy had no clue that he would house Jesus' 12 disciples with Jesus sharing his last meal on earth. And what about the boy with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish? He was a nobody kid. Kids were nothing in that culture. And he shows up, and Jesus has all these people, 5,000 plus, and along comes this boy. And he's got lunch for maybe himself and a family member. And Jesus uses this boy, and when he gives the basket to Jesus, and we see what Jesus does, he blows this thing up. I mean, feeds everybody till their bellies are full and has 12 baskets left over. I mean, can you imagine where this kid would go from that point? I mean, that's nothing. But you put it in the hands of God, and it's everything and then beyond. What about a shepherd boy who's made a king? God tells Samuel, you need to go and find the next king. And so he goes to the house of Jesse. And the Bible says that Samuel visits with all of Jesse's kids. And he's like, no, these are not it. He says, do you have any other kids? And he says, well, yeah, I do have my youngest one, David. He's just out tending sheep. He's just a shepherd. He can't be, he's not king. He's the weakest. He's the smallest. I mean, he tends to my other son's needs. I mean, he's the servant of the house. And we see that Samuel calls David to be king. You want to talk about underdog stories. So the idea is that when the world says you are nothing, God can say you are exactly what I need. You are exactly what I need. I don't care what your circumstances are. God can use you in your circumstances. And we see this with Moses. We look at Moses from the other side of the story that has already happened, and we look at it and say, what a great, magnificent man and all the wonders that he did. But Moses was an underdog story. This morning we're going to look at him, also the Israelites, because Moses said, who am I? Why should I? I can't. In Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 through 29, if you can follow along in your Bibles, it says, by faith, after Moses was born, he was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw that the child was beautiful and they didn't fear the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he'd grown up, refused to be called a son of Pharaoh's daughter, chose to suffer with the people of God rather than enjoy the short-lived pleasure of sin. For he considered the reproach because of the Messiah to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since his attention was on the reward. Verse 27, it says, by faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered, as one who sees him who is invisible. By faith he instituted the Passover and sprinkling of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. By faith they crossed the Red Sea as though they were on dry land. When the Egyptians attempted to do this, they were drowned. Main point, no matter your circumstances, God can work through you. I should also add, in you, because he needs to work in you to work through you. Moses is given the second largest section of this chapter as one of the greatest heroes of the faith, It's a clear reason why that is. Apart from Abraham, Moses was the greatest leader of the Israelites in the history of the nation. He was essentially almost equal to Abraham, okay? Moses, just a little history, born into slavery, he was hidden for 3 months. He was found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in Pharaoh's house, murders an Egyptian, runs away, becomes a sheep herder, and then God calls him to rescue God's people. Okay? That's the brief history, and we're going to go through a lot of that this morning. So again, like so many others, Moses has a very wild story. He was born to this family of slaves. This is about 320 years into that 400-year captivity in Egypt. Okay, God said you'll be there for 400 years. So about in 320 of those 400 years, his life begins. And his parents hide him. He's a slave. And during this time, when he was born, Pharaoh sends out a decree to all the midwives because Israel's starting to grow. There's too many people. And so Pharaoh says, midwives, kill all the newborn male Israelites when they're born. They can't do it. They can't bring themselves to do it. Pharaoh gets angry and he says, all right, take all the young boys, those newborns, and just throw them in the river. Moses' parents defy this new evil law. And so they hide him. How? I don't know. But they hide this boy for 3 months. And over that time, his mom builds this basket, and she places Moses in the basket, places him in the reeds alongside the river. This is where it gets kind of interesting and kind of turns into a weird story. So one day, Pharaoh's daughter, I don't know why she's out with the Israelites. It doesn't seem like the place Pharaoh's daughter would be. But anyway, she's out walking, and she's by the Nile River, and she hears a baby crying. She looks, and there's this little baby in a basket. And so she takes the baby out of the basket, and she's like, what? This is weird. Moses' sister is watching what's happening, and she runs to Pharaoh's daughter and says, hey, do you want me to find someone to nurse this child until he gets a little older? And Pharaoh's daughter's like, well, sure. So the sister runs back to Moses' mom, coincidentally, says, hey, I got this situation. I think it's going to work out. And so Moses' mom ends up nursing Moses, who Pharaoh's daughter found next to the river. And so she nurses her own son. But think of this. She is no longer in danger of losing her son by death, because now this is Pharaoh's daughter's son. So not only is she safe, now she's going to get paid for it. Got quite a deal going on here, all right? So anyway, later, he's done being nursed and has grown up a little bit, and so he is handed over to Pharaoh's daughter to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter, and then he grows up living in Pharaoh's home. But in this beginning, we see great faith in the parents of Moses. They hid him for 3 months leading up to that point because it says there was something, he was beautiful. There's a lot of different translations of that word. It says beautiful in God's sight. There was something special about him. And there's a lot of discussions among theologians as to why that was. I just believe that was God revealing something very special about Moses, called for a very specific purpose. Now, it seems clear that throughout the time these Hebrews were in slavery, the message of God did remain steadfast. I think we see that because they were not into everything that the Egyptians were doing religiously. But God had a plan for his people, and much of it would be done through this one man, Moses. And so we're going to look at Moses a little bit and his faith. And we're going to jump through, that was sort of 23. And so 24 through 26 talks about the faith of Moses, that he didn't want to be called the Pharaoh's daughter, son of the Pharaoh's daughter. He would choose to suffer with God's people rather than live in sin. And he considered reproach because of the Messiah to be greater wealth and treasures in Egypt. He grew up in the home of Pharaoh. Greatest education on the planet at the time. Acts 7:22 says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in his speech and actions. Now that's really interesting. In that time, Egypt was the leading nation on the planet. They ruled the world. And so we see this one man in God's story, and God works out in such a crazy way so that he enters into the home of Pharaoh. But there came a time when we don't know exactly when or by what means that he knew, but he realized that the Israelites were his people. Whether they told him or whatever the means were, he had found out that these were his people, his brothers, his sisters. And at one point, Moses refused to be classified as a part of the royal Egyptian family. In other words, he turned down everything that he could have, everything he could ever want in Pharaoh's home. He gave it up. He turned his back on amazing wealth, the national wealth, the mightiest nation on earth, the treasures, the culture, the influence, and so much more. It says that Moses chose suffering with his people over a short-lived life of sin. Excuse me. Think about the opportunities that one would have for sin living in Pharaoh's home. You would have nothing and want that you could not have in an instant. All of your fleshly desires surrounded you. The temptations that we think of that are temptations to sin would not be temptations. They would be the everyday normality that would just be around. It was part of your life. You would have pleasure, laughter, wine, massive projects, money, a harem, education, work. There was certainly pleasure in them all. And again, not everything that he would do as an Egyptian was not wrong, but as the overall lifestyle, he saw it as meaningless, unfulfilling, and as Solomon said, it is all just vanity. But what was it that brought Moses to this point? What was it that led Moses to consider the Messiah or the reward of what was ahead? There is a man who lived. His name was George Mueller. He was an evangelist who gave everything up for God. If you ever have an opportunity to read his autobiography, I would highly encourage it. But he said, I was converted in November of 1825, but I only came to the full surrender of the heart 4 years later in July of 1829. The love of money was gone. The love of place was gone. The love of position was gone. The love of worldly pleasures and engagements was gone. God alone became my portion. I found my all in Him. I wanted nothing else. And by the grace of God, this has remained and has made me an exceedingly happy man. It led me to care only about things of God. I ask affectionately, my beloved brethren, have you fully surrendered to the heart of God? Or is there this thing or that thing with which you are taken up irrespective of God? I can say from my heart, God is an infinitely loving, lovely being. Oh, be not satisfied until your own innermost soul can say, God is an infinitely lovely being. I believe this is God working in Moses, showing him that God was all he needed. You can have all the stuff in the world, but when you die, it's just stuff that stays. It doesn't go with you. There would have been no education, no teaching of the Messiah from the Egyptians. There would have been, must have been, outside of the work of God, maybe he was involved with the Israelites and they told him. I don't know. But what I consider is that God was speaking to him throughout his life. That God was active throughout his circumstances. To the point he knew those were his people, his family, and God was showing Moses a truth that only God could do. I believe a defining moment in Moses' life that would change the direction of his life forever was when he saw, which probably was not a rare thing, but he saw an Israelite being beaten by an Egyptian. Now, they were slaves. This probably would have been a normal thing on a daily basis, but something in him made him pretty upset about that. And so he goes to the Egyptian and he kills the Egyptian. He commits murder. And so he buries the body, trying to hide what he has just done. The next day, he realizes that even the Israelites know what he did, and they're calling him out on it. Then Pharaoh has found out, and Pharaoh tries to kill him. So Moses ran away. He takes off. He ends up in the desert for 40 years. He would run to the land called Midian. Now, I did not know this was important until this week, but Midian was a place that he ran to because the Midianites were of the seed of Abraham and retained the worship of the true God among them so that he might have not only a safe but a comfortable settlement among them. And so during this time, he spends these 40 years in Midian with these godly people, and he gets the direction, he's had the direction from Egypt, but now he would spend 40 years being instructed and trained in the teachings of God, of the God of Abraham. God used this time to prepare Moses to be ready to go back to Egypt to free his people after God appeared to him in a burning bush. And so the return to Exodus. These two verses in 27 and 28 hold a lot of information that we could spend weeks getting into. But for the sake of time, I want to look at them briefly and see the power that lies within each one. 27 is, by faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. And by faith he instituted the Passover, the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch the Israelites. 40 years after Moses runs away from Egypt as a murderer, God calls an 80-year-old sheep herder to bring his people, to bring God's people out of Egypt. How does he do it? Okay, one of the coolest stories, it's a very short point in the book of Exodus. God leads him to Mount Horeb. Now, he's 80 years old, and he's a sheep herder of a flock that's not even his own. It's his father-in-law's at this point. He doesn't own anything. He's just the son-in-law, and he's a sheeper. I mean, he's got nothing. He has no rights to anything. In Egypt, to the Israelites, he's forgotten about. He's been gone. He left. He might as well have just died somewhere. He's a nobody. And then God shows up at Mount Horeb in this really crazy way. He sees this bush that's on fire. Now, how many of you have seen a fire, a wildfire? I grew up in Wyoming, in northwest Wyoming, around Yellowstone, and every year there's wildfires. And I've been near them, and I've seen how fast they can move and how much damage they do in such a short period of time. So to walk up to a bush in the desert that's on fire but not burning up would be a pretty extravagant experience. And then you hear Moses. All right, see ya. Talking bush that's on fire. I'm out of here, right? But he goes to it, and God talks to him. He uses it to capture his attention. And they have this amazing dialogue. And up to this point, for the last 40 years, again, Moses, forgotten. No use in the world, just a shepherd of sheep that didn't even belong to him. He was a nobody, but God tends to like to use the nobodies in the world. In Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 9, it says, "The Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore go, I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses asked God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? I'm a nobody. I have no worth in the world. I am ill-prepared. I am unequipped. I am a waste. I am trash." So he answered, "I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I have sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship God at this mountain." Then Moses asked God, "If I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what should I tell them?" God replied to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. There's so much power in that statement. God also says to Moses, say this to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac and Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. It's easy to look at a situation that we see as insurmountable and to say, who am I that I should go after this? Who am I that you would call me to this thing, to work with these people, to go to this nation? Who am I? Moses was an 80-year-old runaway murderer. He had nothing going for him. He comes from Pharaoh's house, but he's also an Israelite. And so why would he want to go back? And why would Pharaoh listen to him? God says, tell them, I am has sent you. Moses obeys, and he heads to Egypt. He meets his older brother Aaron. They go before all the Israelite elders, and they tell them all that God has said, and then they confront Pharaoh. I have no idea how he got into the palace where Pharaoh lived. I mean, that's like, you don't just walk into the White House and be like, I'm here to see the president. It's not happening, okay? But it's more than that. It would be like, me going to North Korea, walking into their palace and say, hey, buddy, you're no longer in charge. Your communism is over, and so we're just going to free all these people. First of all, you're probably not going to get in. But second of all, if you did, you're probably dead before you even hit the floor, right? I mean, you don't do that. But through some work of God, they show up and they're like, hey, Pharaoh, we need to have a chat. But what happens when they get in there? Pharaoh's like, no, I think I'm not going to let you take the people out of here. And so God sends plagues. There's 10 in all. And so he sends the first 9. And after the signs and miracles and the plagues, Pharaoh was committed in his heart to be against God and God's people. And so before God brings plague number 10, he gives very strict instructions to the Israelites. And he prepares Moses and Aaron to lead the people out of Egypt, knowing that this would be the time that they would be released. They're given these instructions. They are to have 1 animal per household. They're to kill it, keep the blood, eat the animal, and be prepared to leave. So take your blood and wipe it around your doorposts, because I'm coming with this last plague. That night, the first Passover came. God comes through all of Egypt. He passes over each house that had blood placed over it. But in any house, including the palace, death would come to their firstborn males, both animal and human. So, because of this, Pharaoh says, leave. I can't handle it. He's heartbroken. His son died. And he tells them to go. So, they come to this point, which is probably the most epic scene outside of creation itself to have ever taken place in the history of the world. You've got 3 million approximately numbers of just freed slaves. Party on, we're out of here, good things are waiting for us. So they come to this point. They see the dust coming up behind them. Pharaoh changed his mind. He's like, I'm going to go kill them. I'm killing all of them. We're not doing this. He is angry. He's bitter. He is out for blood, and he is determined to get it. And so these Israelites, they're hustling. And they get to this point. God says, I'm going to free you. And then all of a sudden they come to this beach, and freedom's on the other side, and there is a sea in front of them. do you think your inclination would be at that point? We're dead. Thanks a lot. You just ripped us off. Life may not have been good back there, but at least we were alive. And you just killed us. In Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 12 says, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, saw the Egyptians coming after them. Then the Israelites were terrified. They cried out to the Lord for help. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Isn't this what we told you in Egypt? Leave us alone so that we may serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. Now, these people have seen some crazy things in the past few days. Those 10 plagues were pretty gnarly, right? Things were happening. But realistically and logically, they had fear that they were going to die. Nobody's ever parted water before. This was not a thing that you just do. I mean, they're like, safety's over there, and we're back over here. And we don't have any boats. We got nothing. And there's an army coming right behind us to kill us. We face unbelievable obstacles. There's this sea in front of us. We know that if we can get through what's happening right now, if we can get to the other side, we're safe. But there's this thing that's coming after me to destroy me, to come after me, to tear me down, to break me apart. Maybe it's an addiction that you're struggling with and you just can't get past it and you feel like the devil's on your back trying to kill you. Maybe you're dealing with this issue with work and you don't know how to deal with that. You don't know how to talk to your boss and it's eating at you and you're not able to sleep at night. And your family is being ruined by it. Maybe you have a relationship with a family member or a close friend that's dissolving and it's tearing you apart emotionally. Maybe you have health concerns or complications that seem unbearable and you know that the devil's just trying to drag you down. The devil's trying to kill you and to get you to give up on God. Maybe you have a decision to make that's life-altering. Maybe a move, maybe a new job, maybe a new career, whatever it may be. There's something happening, and you need to get to the other side of it. But right in front of you looks like you are going to die. The Israelites were facing the sea. Literal sea, water. You don't just cross over. And God calls to Moses, as for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I kind of wonder what Moses was thinking. Now, did I hear that right? You want me to what? Okay. Picks up a staff and he stretches out a hand, and as sure as I am standing here, the water moves out of the way. Dry ground. Like that. God says, go. 3 million freed slaves. Can you imagine the stories they would tell later? They're walls of water, and they're walking on dry ground. The army's still behind them. They're still being chased. They get through, and Pharaoh and his army comes in after them. What happens? The sea collapses on them, and they all drown. It kills them all. They are free. They have no more enemies. Can you imagine the faith after that point? I wonder how many of us have experienced situations that we have crossed. We've walked that dry ground. We've got to that. We are free from the stuff that was behind us trying to kill us, to tear us down, to drag us from God. How many of us have reached the other side with this issue or that? Could we use those more than a learning experience, but use those for the people in our lives that are experiencing what we've been through. And we can say, look, we've made it to the other side. You will make it to the other side. Yeah, there's a fight, there's fear. The devil is on the attack, but you can make it to the other side. Here's how I did it. And I want to walk with you through it. You are not alone. God works in amazing ways. God is known for using the least likely people to work out His will. We see it all throughout the Bible. And if we believe God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that God always is, always was, why do we think He would do anything different today? God still uses unsuspecting people in amazing ways. Many of you are facing battles today. Some are facing physical battles. Your bodies are in rough shape. The devil is working overtime to bring you down, to drag you from God. You keep wondering if you can even do anything, let alone anything for the kingdom of God. Some of you are facing spiritual battles. The devil is on your doorstep. He is knocking down your house. He is coming in. He is telling you lies, and you are struggling to not believe in the lies the devil is telling you. He's doing everything he can to drag you away from God. I am fairly certain that each one of us are probably facing some kind of battle today. It's the world we live in, and the devil is working overtime. God has given him a time limit, and he is working hard to drag us down with him. Are you looking at how God is preparing to open up before you an opportunity for you to get through this situation? Now, he is probably not going to ask you to go out to Lovewell Reservoir and to, put your hands up and open up the water. I mean, it could happen. If it does, take a picture. I'd love to see it. But there are things in our life that God is like, look, I am right here. Last week we talked about there are times we don't feel God in our midst. We don't feel, we don't hear, but he said, I am with you. When he left and he told his disciples to go into all the world, preaching the gospel, baptizing, creating these disciples, and know that I am with you always. We may not feel God. We may not hear God. We may be digging in the Word just to know that he actually spoke, because we haven't sensed God working in our lives, but we know that he's here because he promised he would be here, and he will take care of all of your needs. What are the greatest promises we have? We may not feel it in the moment, but we know as we see in eternity, God is with us. He can use your situation for his glory. We may see the struggling side of it. We may not always see the fruit of our faithfulness. Now that's hard for me because I like seeing the fruit of the labor, right? I like doing work and seeing the project completed, because you can see what you've done. But sometimes as Christians, we don't always see the fruit of our labor. We may suffer for a while, yet not see what God will do with the fruit. But we trust that God is with us and working in our situation through our faithfulness. If you're here and you know that you need Jesus, but you have pushed him away, or you are pushing him away because of the struggles in your life, I want to invite you. Jesus is inviting you to open up your hearts, to break down the walls, to invite him in, to let him be Lord of your life, to free you from sin, so that as the devil, the army approaches, he is with you walking through you. That doesn't mean that it's all going to be sunshine and rainbows and that the devil's not going to attack, because he is. Some of us have lashes on our backs from the devil's attacks. We've got battle wounds from the attacks of the devil. It's very real. But know that God is with you, that he will work with you through it, and that he will save you. Most importantly, not from this life, but save you from sin so that you can have life eternal with him. That's the key. That's what's most important. So if you're here and you need Jesus, as we close and sing our last song, this is a time where you can come forward to receive Jesus, and we will work with you and walk with you through that, where you can come and make that confession of faith. If you are here and you need prayer and encouragement to get through a battle you're facing, we invite you to come forward as well. This is a great opportunity where we come together as a body of Christ, as a family, because you think about those those Israelites. They're on the banks of the Red Sea. It wasn't just one person. It wasn't just Moses. They were there as a family of God's people. But most importantly, they had God on their side. They had God with them. Moses did not part the sea. He was obedient, and God parted the sea. Be obedient, and let God work in your life. As we sing this last song, if you need to come forward, please do.